God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. So why is Jesus picking on the Pharisees? What is the backstory to today's gospel? And in the next couple of Sundays, the gospel readings are about kind of listening in on these conversations between different religious factions in Jesus' world. And so I'm going to give you a little background as to kind of what that is. And you know, some of us are a little worried about the world that we live in these days, or the country that we live in these days, and we think we're kind of all going to hell in a handbasket. But there's something really interesting if you look into the context, the world in which Jesus was born, the time, the era, the people who were in political and religious leadership. We're okay right now compared to what was going on when God decided that God was going to intervene in human affairs in a particular place at a particular time. The Jewish writer David Goldberg describes the period that Jesus was born into as one of the most terrible periods of history. And he talks about how even the Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus, when he is describing the leadership of King Herod, who's ruling over this little petty province of Judea, Caesar Augustus says about Herod, "It were better to be such a man's pig than his son." And this ruler of Judea, he had his wife murdered, his 2 sons murdered, and any relative that he suspected as threatening his security. And, you know, Herod in his paranoia is known for the story around Christmas time when he slaughters all the children 2 and under. Such was this crazy ruler at the time. This was the context in which God becomes incarnate in Jesus. And there are 4 basic groups or factions that are vying for power, and they're trying to change the way things were run back then. The first group, the Pharisees that we read about in today's gospel. The second group, the Sadducees. The third group, the Essenes. And the fourth group, the revolutionaries or the zealots. And what's interesting is the Gospels give us, we drop in on these conversations between these 4 factions that are trying to fight out their own kind of theological and political positions. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees are fighting it out in Parliament, in the Sanhedrin, which was the government of the time that met in the temple. And we know about this, we know about some of the sort of background to this, not only through the Gospels, but other history that tells us about that period. So first of all, the Pharisees, who were the Pharisees? They were this very religious, powerful group that for about a century before Jesus were gaining respect and authority. They were very much holy people. They believed in giving back to God and taking care of your neighbors. They, unlike the Sadducees, the Sadducees had basically 10 laws, the 10 commandments, the law of Moses that they followed. But the Pharisees had 613 laws. And a lot of that was about the oral tradition of the rabbis was about, to be a good Jewish person, there were certain rules that you had to follow. And one of those rules was that you had to tithe. You had to give 1/10 of your income to support the work of God through the temple. And what was one of the sort of backstories to that, when the Pharisees are complaining to Jesus about you're eating with sinners, that even restaurants back then would give 1/10 of their income to the temple. So when Jesus is having dinner outside of these non-licensed restaurants, the Pharisees are very upset that he's not respecting the laws and that he's healing people on on the Sabbath. So the Pharisees were a very powerful group in the country, and they were in opposition to the Sadducees. And who were the Sadducees? They were the aristocracy of Jesus' time. They were the nobility. They were the people who controlled the temple, which was the largest economy in the country. And they had an elected, an appointed person, kind of like the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was a representative of religion and the state, in the high priest. And these kind of noble families kind of controlled everything. And so they were kind of despised. The tax collector in the gospel would have worked for the Sadducees. And Rome kind of watched all this, kind of was the umbrella watching these people kind of fighting it out, maybe not understanding fully what the arguments were all about. The Sadducees, for instance, did not believe in resurrection, the resurrection of the dead. And again, they were traditionalists. They stuck to the 10 commandments rather than these 600 plus laws that the Pharisees had. Then we had the Essenes. And who were the Essenes? In our day, we would kind of regard them as hippies. They were an alternative community who reject society, reject the leadership. The world is going to hell in a handbasket, and so you've got to get out of it. And they move to the edge of the city. They form a community in the desert that is both of single people and married people and children. And we know a lot about the Essenes because the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in the middle of the last century tell us a lot about their values and their traditions. And for instance, the tradition of baptism, you were initiated into the Essene community through a baptism, and that they had a kind of love feast, rather like the Eucharist. But they were very influenced by writings that we would call today apocryphal. And they would have been images that the world is going to be destroyed, it's on a collision course to disaster, and at one point God will intervene, and there'll be some kind of savior Messiah figure who will break it. And so the Essenes are kind of on the edges, waiting for someone else to come and fix it. And then the final group are the Zealots. We would call the Zealots today terrorists. Yeah, they had terrorism in Jesus' time. And there's a wonderful book that just came out a couple of years ago. It's actually called Zealot. And basically you had somebody who would say, hey, I'm the Messiah, follow me. And they would be either people of believing of violence, that change comes about, the overthrow of the Roman imperial, get them out of our country. Or there were also zealots who were pacifists, who valued the issues of justice and fighting for equality and not being oppressed by groups that are outside. And so Jesus would have been aware of all of these conversations. And it's interesting that even among Jesus' inner circle, the disciples, Simon the Zealot is a member of Jesus' community. So he would be certainly familiar with the Zealot movement. But Jesus didn't believe in violence. You know, there's a conversation in the New Testament where there's an act of terror on a Roman, this technological miracle, this great water aqueduct that Rome had built in the middle of nowhere, and the Zealots destroy it, and people are killed. And so one of the conversations with Jesus is, what do you think of that? Did these people do something wrong? And then Jesus has an opportunity to talk about these people didn't do anything wrong. So that is the kind of the political and religious scene that we keep dipping into in the Gospels. And they're trying to test Jesus. Which side are you taking, Jesus? Are you with the Pharisees? Are you with the Sadducees? Are you a zealot? Are you influenced by the Essene community? Are you going to kind of opt out, move away? And what's very interesting about the Gospels is that Jesus kind of synergizes the best of all of those traditions. You know, we know that Jesus respects the traditions of the temple. He goes to worship and offer sacrifice at the temple. He's not come to destroy the law, but to complete the law. But he is critical that the Sadducees are basically elite and corrupt. You know that image of him going and turning the money changer tables over? That he's saying, the Sadducees, you have made my house a den of robbers instead of a house of prayer. He's critical of the Pharisees because he talks about you heap burdens on ordinary people's shoulders, that these rules, these 600 rules, don't make sense. You're not helping people. And he's critical in today's gospel of their piety. They think they're better than everybody else. They're tithing, they're going to worship, they're doing all the right things, but their heart is just not in the right place. So he's critical. He values their commitment, but he doesn't agree with their methods. We know that John the Baptist and Jesus was also influenced by the Essene community, the use of baptism, and also influenced by that apocryphal. Jesus is very influenced by the idea that the Messiah is going to come and fix it, but not maybe in the way that most people thought about it. A different kind of Messiah, not a warrior Messiah who's going to bring about change through violence, but a Messiah who's going to be the suffering servant who is going to bring God's kingdom through love and justice. And the Zealots, again, he loved their passion, but he was a pacifist. He did not believe in violence for its own end. So I hope that helps us when these gospel stories come up. They're testing Jesus. They're trying to figure out who he is. But he synergizes the best of them, and he creates a different kind of movement. And it's very interesting when the Gospels are written, the temple is destroyed, the Sadducees are gone, and that because of the faithfulness of the Pharisees, that what we know of Judaism today survives largely because of the Pharisees, that they continued the tradition of offering temple worship in the synagogue, feasts like Yom Kippur and the Day of Atonement. It was the Pharisees that took the remnants of Judaism and made it what it is today. And the irony is, it is a Pharisee that Jesus appears to on the road to Damascus, and he becomes the number 2 in the movement, our own St. Paul. And Paul was basically this kind of rabid fundamentalist who wanted to kill the people in the way, and he's got orders to kill somebody in the name of God because they're blaspheming against God, and something intervenes. And again, so out of this, all of these conversations, the role of the Pharisaic community is vital to our understanding of Judaism and Christianity as we know it today. So where do we take all that in terms of our own lives, our own synergizing in our world? What does it mean for our country to hear all the voices and take what we can that is good and reject that which we think is wrong or not something that is going to be good for the country or good for the world? Or what does that mean in terms of our community of St. Paul? What can we learn from Jesus about how we handle diversity? How do we handle all of those groups that are still very much with us? We still have the aristocracy. We still have the Sadducees in the Episcopal Church. We are still very much the imperial church. And how do we take the best of that? And how do we link that to people who have other different forms of worship and tradition and theology? And how do we involve the Essenes? There are people in the congregation, they want to stay on the edges. We don't want to get involved. We'll just wait till the new rector's hired, then we might come back. We have our own kind of people who opt out, who are waiting for a savior to come in. Right? And we've got our zealots. We've got our people who are passionate. And we've got some very left-wing people in St. Paul's who have a very important voice and keep us honest and keep us connected. So the invitation, if we are to follow Jesus, if we are to see Jesus as the embodiment of a different way of being human, we have to find ways that we engage the other, and that we assimilate and we connect and we synergize that which is the best in all, and we move forward. And we also talk directly. What I love about these conversations is Jesus isn't avoiding people. He's not avoiding issues. He's not triangulating. He's not using back doors of communication. He's right on communicating. This is how it is, people. Come on, bring it on. And he stands his ground. And that is a model for us as a community where we may not feel comfortable having those direct conversations. But if we follow Jesus, we're invited to do that. So watch out for those conversations. They're coming up. We have more stories like this. And I hope that after today's sermon, that they make a little more sense to us as we listen to them and as we take them in and as we try and apply these principles in our daily life today. Amen.